And joining us once again, Yossi Klein Halevi, Senior Fellow at the Adelson Institute for Strategic Studies at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem. And we're always happy when you join us here on the agenda. Nice to see you again, Yossi.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we got a lot to talk about here, and I want to start, obviously, with the U.S. election. When an international survey of countries was done very recently, overwhelmingly, people surveyed wanted Obama over McCain. I think in this country it was 69 to 15%. There were two countries in this survey where McCain won, Philippines and yours.
Not Poland? I was surprised about that.
How come?
Because Israelis are concerned overwhelmingly with one issue, and that is a nuclear Iran. When it came to support for Israel, the widespread feeling within Israel was that both candidates were friends, and both vice presidential candidates were friends. So funnily enough for Israel, this election was not about Israel at all. It was about Iran.
Where does this notion that Obama is bad on Israel come from?
I think that partly it came from the malicious rumors that were circulated about a year ago that he's a secret Muslim. The truth is that that never took hold within Israel. Most Israelis really didn't pay attention to that. And instead, I think Israelis were more concerned about the fact that this was a first-term senator. And if he were elected president, he'd be stepping in to the greatest world crisis, probably since the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least from where we sit in the Middle East. The prospect of Iran going nuclear is seen as the strategic crisis of this generation. And we wanted someone, most Israelis wanted someone, with some security background and experience in order to be able to handle this.
I don't want to oversimplify this, but you are surrounded by, what, 21 Arab countries?
21.
21. His middle name is Hussein. Did that play a factor?
And it's interesting. It didn't register. Israelis, you know, I think that the feeling among Israelis was that if the Democratic Party nominates a candidate, or the Republican Party for that matter, chances are this guy will be okay for Israel. And when he stood at the AIPAC conference, AIPAC is the pro-Israel lobby in Washington, when he stood at the conference and he said that I am committed to the Israeli-American relationship, this relationship is sacrosanct. That was banner headlines in Israel. So the Israeli public was not anti-Obama. Certainly nothing along the lines of the wild rumors and insinuations that you heard on the fringes of the right.
Okay, then let me explore the why Israel is so pro-McCain. Yes. And that is, you know, many people observed over here that McCain is obviously in favor of the Iraq War. He was in favor of the surge. He's in favor of more troops in Afghanistan. Some would allege that he's a little too trigger happy. And given that, you know, Israelis live in probably one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the world, why would the idea of a potentially trigger-happy president sit well with Israelis? Because
Israelis are more fearful of a gun-shy American president than a trigger-happy president. We are, at the moment, in an existential mode again. You know, it rises and falls in Israel. The 90s, for example, during the Oslo peace period, was a time of great optimism. Israelis were allowing themselves to breathe and to let go of some of our existential fears. With the nuclear countdown in Iran now being measured in a matter of months rather than years, at least according to Israeli intelligence, the psyche in Israel has really reverted back to survivalist mode. And when you're in that kind of a mode, you're not worried about the guy who may seem a little too reckless. You're worried about the guy who may seem too cautious.
So peace with the Palestinians, if Obama were to make that a priority in his foreign policy, Israelis would not look at that with favor. Is that what I hear you saying?
It's a complicated answer because most Israelis today, the latest poll showed 70%, support a two-state solution, want a Palestinian state, and see a Palestinian state as being as much in our national interest as in the Palestinians' interest. The problem is twofold. One is that most Israelis today don't believe that a workable Palestinian state is possible given the preeminence of Hamas. And the second related problem is that so long as Iran is perceived to be on a trajectory of victory, heading toward Middle East dominance, then the Arab world in general and the Palestinians in particular are going to keep hedging their bets. The Palestinians will not make peace with Israel as long as there are substantial numbers of Palestinians who think, let's hold out, and Iran is going to liberate Jerusalem. We may not need to compromise with Israel. And that's the appeal of Hamas. Hamas has linked its fate with Iran. And until you don't reduce the support for Hamas among the Palestinians, you can't reach a two-state solution.
Many Americans were both thrilled and horrified when Barack Obama said during the course of the, I guess, the lead up to the presidential campaign, and this is while he was fighting for the nomination with Senator Clinton, when he said he was in favor of discussions with the Iranians about these issues without preconditions. What's the Israeli view on that?
I would say that the normative Israeli view is that Obama is 4 years too late. Had America begun negotiations 4 years ago, and not open-ended, but with a very tight timetable, testing the other side's intentions, when those negotiations would inevitably fail, as everyone in position of authority in Israel believes they will fail, because Iran is determined as a strategic goal to achieve nuclear capability, then the United States would have to move to an aggressive sanctions mode and try to mobilize the international community. Given the fact that we may be only 18 months away from Iran crossing the nuclear threshold, we don't have the luxury of time to play out a long and drawn-out negotiating process to be followed by an attempt to impose sanctions. What we need right now from day one is a very strong sanctions effort, especially aimed at the oil industry in Iran, which is very vulnerable now with the decline in prices.
And what's the likelihood of that coming out of this administration, this incoming administration?
I think that they are in favor of aggressive sanctions. My only concern is how long will they give a futile negotiating process to play out before they move to a more active mode.
Well, there's no doubt he's getting, as all presidents do, conflicting advice from different camps on what he ought to do. Do you know how the camps kind of situate themselves on this?
I don't know if anyone outside of his circle can really say at this point. And you know, it's true what you say that all politicians like to surround themselves with different opinions, but I don't know of another presidential candidate in recent memory who has surrounded himself with such wildly contradictory camps. You know, he's got the camp that's very hardline on Iran, then he's got the camp which I think Joe Biden, for example, is part of, which is a military strike against Iran would be the worst case scenario, better to live with a nuclear Iran. I think he's getting such disparate input that I'm concerned about that.
Which camp are you in?
Do everything you can through sanctions to prevent Iran from going nuclear, and if that fails, then a military strike to forestall a nuclear Iran. Because from where I sit in the Middle East, and it's not only from an Israeli perspective, it's also from the perspective of many of the Arab leaders, a nuclear Iran is the most apocalyptic scenario that one can imagine. Even if they don't use their nuclear weapon, the very fact that they will have nuclear capability, first of all, will end any possibility of a negotiated peace to the Palestinian conflict. The Palestinians simply will not show up to the table. Hamas will put a veto on it. Other Arab countries will be terrified of crossing Iran. It will mean the end of a negotiated peace in the Middle East. The Arab states realize this. The Europeans realize this. I was in Europe not so long ago as part of a seminar on Iran. European leaders realize that a nuclear Iran will end the prospect for peace in the Middle East.
You know, many people said the same thing about India and Pakistan before they got nuclear capability, and now they've had it for several years. And yes, there have been some close calls, but saner heads have always prevailed at the last second. You don't think that's a good example for the Middle East?
I'm worried when you say close calls. In the Middle East, close calls tend to play out as conflict. When we have close calls, the passions are so intense, and the issues at stake are so vital to both sides that we don't really know how to finesse close calls into peaceful resolution.
Finesse and Middle East usually don't go in the same sentence, do they?
Do not go together.
You know, President-elect Obama did visit Israel earlier this year, and I wondered what kind of conversation was there in Israel at the time of his visit in terms of what impact people think that visit made on him?
Well, I think that Obama, before his visit to Israel, was very different on Iran than after his visit. My understanding is that every politician that Obama met with in Israel, Labor, left-wing Labor, centrist Kadima, right-wing Likud, all conveyed variations of the identical message, which is that Israel cannot and will not live with a nuclear Iran.
And did he get that?
I heard from someone very close to him that he didn't sleep for a week, the week that he was in the Middle East. And I was told that the thinking in his circle was that this was not because of jet lag, that he finally internalized the fact that he is going to be the guy to deal with the great crisis in the world today. And my understanding further is that in his meetings with Arab leaders, he heard a similar message. So I think he came away from the Middle East realizing that this is far more serious than he thought it was. You know, about 8 months ago, he made a statement saying that Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela are small countries, and we can deal with these problems. I don't think Obama would say that today.
He would not be the first president to come into office, though, with a massive domestic challenge on his hands, and therefore completely overwhelming any ideas or thoughts or progress he'd hoped to make in foreign policy. Do you think Israelis are concerned that, given the nature of the financial crisis he's dealing with at home, he just won't have time or brain cells to deal with this?
I think Israelis are concerned with something else, which is that if he feels the need to make a quick mark on foreign policy, he'll try to revive the Palestinian track. And the problem from the Israeli point of view is that, again, as long as Hamas is in power, there's no possibility for a deal, so he'll be wasting his political capital on a dead end instead of dealing with the burning issue, which is preventing a nuclear Iran.
Okay, let's talk some Israeli domestic politics.
We'll go to something lighter.
A little easier, yeah. You got elections coming up in February '09. How's it shaping up right now? Ehud Olmert, the prime minister, is leaving under a cloud.
Under a rain cloud.
Under a rain cloud. You got new leaders in some of the parties. How's it shaping up?
It looks like it's going to be a very close race between Tzipi Livni, she's the head of the centrist Kadima party, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister and head of the right-wing Likud.
Everything old is new again.
Everything in Israel comes around again. And it's very close for the following reason. After the devastating impact of Olmert's brief administration, Olmert was the most corrupt prime minister that we've ever had. The Israeli public is desperate for clean government. And Tzipi Livni is running on a clean government platform. Her weakness is in security and military affairs.
She has much less military experience than all the other generals who are running, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Netanyahu wasn't a general, but Netanyahu was a commando, and as former prime minister, he learned what he needed to know. So, given the fact that many Israelis still have traumatic memories of the Lebanon war 2 years ago, when the first prime minister that we had with no military experience, Ehud Olmert, presided over the worst military defeat in the country's history, many Israelis are looking now for someone who will be competent in security. Livni may be competent, we don't know. My sense is that however close the race is going to be, at this particular time, given the nature of Israeli fears, Netanyahu is going to win.
He's the man to beat.
I think so.
Do you find that extraordinary? Yeah, I mean, we remember when he left under such a cloud last time. People couldn't wait to throw him out, and here he is.
I know. You know, Netanyahu has one very powerful argument, and I expect to see this played out in the TV commercials that the Likud will run. And that is that when we withdrew from Gaza about 3 years ago, Netanyahu warned that if we pull the army out of Gaza, there will be rocket attacks on the Israeli city of Ashkelon, which is about 15 miles away from Gaza. And our colleagues in the Israeli media ridiculed Netanyahu as an alarmist, an apocalypticist. And all Netanyahu has to do is play the footage of rockets demolishing the shopping mall in Ashkelon in order to remind Israelis who called the shots. So Netanyahu, for all of his flaws, Netanyahu has deep character flaws. He's not particularly liked by the Israeli public. But there's grudging respect for his ability to read the map.
So if security is, as you say, the issue, and Israel is going through an existential phase again, where it questions its own survival because of the Iranian issue, what is Tzipi Livni's argument for why she ought to be prime minister, given her lack of experience in security?
Because everyone knows that the first step that anyone who wins this election will be to invite the opposition into a national unity government. It doesn't matter if it's Tzipi Livni, if it's Netanyahu, or the third candidate who we haven't even mentioned, Ehud Barak of the Labour Party.
Speaking of everything old being new again.
Everything old being new, with the exception of Labour now running a distant third. Bear in mind that Labour is the founding party of Israel. And it's astonishing to me that Labour has fallen so low that it's barely a factor in the election. So I think that Livni's argument will be that we're going to create a national unity government, and everyone knows that no narrow government can make the fateful decision of a preemptive strike against Iran without mainstream political support.
Is that why the national unity government option is really the only option going forward?
It's the only option. Huh. So the question really is not who is going to head the next government, but who's going to head the next national unity government.
It's still a few months before the election. So what kind of, in the States they call them October surprises, what kind of surprises over the next 3 months could tip this election one way or another?
If Hamas resumes shelling Israeli towns, I think Netanyahu is a shoo-in. If the ceasefire holds, if Hezbollah behaves itself until February, Livni has a chance.
Sometimes, and we've seen this, the opponents of Israel actually endorse various political parties. How might that affect the vote one way or another?
In terms of an endorsement from...
what if Hamas came out and said, we want Livni?
Well, fortunately for the mental health of and the integrity of the Israeli political system, the jihadists consider all Israeli parties to be equally invalid. So there isn't a chance of that.
Let's finish up on this Iran issue. I remember interviewing people as long ago as a year and a half or 2 years ago who were saying, and these were reputable sources within Israel, who were saying there are going to be planes in the sky dropping bombs on perceived Iranian nuclear development sites within the next few months. Take it to the bank. Right. It hasn't happened yet.
Right.
What's going on?
That question has been asked in Israel because according to our old intelligence assessments, 2007 was the point of no return. Now, one answer that's being offered is that there's been a high level of sabotage within Iran of nuclear facilities. And the hint that's, of course, being made is that Israel is at work, but not only Israel. Apparently there are other Western intelligence services that are actively engaged in trying to stop Iran behind the scenes. We know there have been some supposed accidents that several nuclear scientists in Iran have met with. So there has been, one way or another, there have been mishaps. They're not on schedule for whatever reason. Whether that continues I don't think that it can indefinitely forestall a nuclear Iran. There really, at this point, as I see it, really only one of two possibilities. Either serious international sanctions that hurt the Iranian economy to the point where the Iranian people rise up and say, it's not worth it to see our society destroyed for the sake of a nuclear fantasy. Or alternatively, and this is a terrible option for Israel because we know what the consequences will be for Israeli society, a preemptive military strike. Iran is already on record as saying they will hit Tel Aviv massively with missiles. We can anticipate terror attacks against Israeli and diaspora Jewish targets if Israel attacks Iran. Given all of that, and the atmosphere, the mood among Israeli policymakers is deeply sober on Iran. No one is trigger happy on Iran because of the consequences. But given all of that, the fear of Iran reaching the point of no return and creating an irreversible reality where a potentially lunatic regime would be in charge of the ultimate weapon is something that Israel and our Arab neighbors can't imagine. And this creates new opportunities for Israel in the sense that we now have an enemy in common with the Arab world. And we're seeing all kinds of very interesting, quiet negotiations and alliances emerging between Israel and the Arab countries in the face of this common Iranian threat.
Well, you're even talking to Syria now, aren't you?
Well, Syria is a particular problem because Syria, of course, is Iran's leading ally, Syria and Hezbollah in the Arab world. And the hope is to try to pry Syria away from its alliance with Iran. I don't think that's going to happen.
You know, as long as I've known you, you have generally been a pretty good barometer for how things feel in Israel. And when I first met you, you were a much more optimistic person than I see today. You really are, you seem to be anyway, much less sanguine about your country's future at the moment. Am I reading that right?
You're reading that right in the short term. I think we're heading into the next year or two, probably the most difficult period in Israel's history, given the unfolding Iranian crisis. One way or another, however this plays out, it will be the most difficult moment for Israel. Long term, or I would even say middle term, I'm much more optimistic than I was in the past about the chance of Israel reaching some kind of accommodation with the Arab world precisely because of the Iranian threat. During the Second Lebanon War, 3 Arab countries, Jordan, Egypt, and even Saudi Arabia, all condemned Hezbollah, took Israel's side, and that had never happened before.
At first.
At first, that's right. And then they backed away when Israel didn't deliver the goods. We didn't defeat Hezbollah. So nevertheless, it pointed to a very significant shift in the thinking in part of the Arab world, that Israel is the lesser of two evils. Iran is by far the greater threat. Look, we saw it even more dramatically when Israel bombed the Syrian reactor last year. Not a single Arab country protested. Now, that was an astonishing moment. And we've passed by that too quickly. It really signifies a new Middle East in which Israel potentially can find its place. So in that sense, it's the Middle East, which means that good things happen through bad things.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
That's the Middle East.
Yossi Klein Halevi, it's always good of you to join us here on TVO. Thanks so much.
Pleasure to be with you always.